911, what's your emergency?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the PIO Podcast, a place to discuss all public information-related topics for police, fire, EMS, and local and federal government organizations.
It was a good learning experience for a lot of us that social media is not real life.
But we have to remember the media are very rarely a target audience. They're simply that conduit.
I think what's so interesting about this position too, and this job and this profession, is that every one of us is looking for purpose. And when we find it here, that's it.
Welcome to the PIO Podcast. This is a year-end wrap-up of 2022 with excerpts from some of our favorite guests. So sit back and enjoy. So our first episode with Dr. Joe Trahan is where we start off today's wrap-up. So enjoy.
I'm a big believer in being proactive. I'm a big believer in getting ahead of the story. I want to shape the message, not be shaped by the message. So I'm a big believer. When you say what's going on, this is the only time my soundbite's going to be longer. Well, the second time is going to be the closing statement. So 2 times. I'm going to give you 25 to 50 seconds to tell me who, what, where, when, why, how, command message, fermez la bouche, which is French for shut your mouth. And you want to guide the interview. That's what I want to do. And I like that. And again, I would tell reporters when I was in the Army, if you're going to trash my Army, my military, you better give me my opportunity to tell my side of the story. If you don't, I'll go back after you. That's just me. I mean, to me, fair and balanced is very important, and it's hard today, especially in today's media. And then the closing statement, I teach people because we're nervous and we're thinking, oh my goodness, thank God the interview is going to end. When at the end, if they ask anything else to add, you're going to add it. If they don't, then you add it. My best advice is repeat the opening statement. This is what I talked about. This is what you can do. Boom, 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 boom. Who, what, where, when, why, how, command message, and stop. I just think it's a big thing. To me, we can only control our own behavior. We can control what they're going to do with it. But I want to give you my information. I'm proud of the organizations I've represented. Have we made mistakes? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But to me, good stories are balanced stories. When I read, I consume like 8 or 9 media sources a day. I'm a sick puppy. And, you know, because I'm looking, every time I read a story, I'm looking for both sides in it. Because I have a brain. That's why I can't stand talk radio and talk TV about that. Don't tell me what to think. That's just my big pet peeve.
From Season 2, Episode 2, PIO Lieutenant Jonathan Baxter from San Francisco Fire Department, and he covers knowing your community and its value.
The sky is the limit. That is the 100%er to make you successful in public safety, no matter what your position is, from the chief all the way down to a basic firefighter, is get to know your community, get to know your community groups. They will, and in my case, have provided you with language access, language transcripts, language services, both verbally and in infograms. They have provided you with valuable information on things that are occurring in their specific community that we may not be aware of. They will provide you with things that they're not happy with a certain fire engine or fire truck that did, but they didn't want to say anything, or they were going to say something publicly, but because you had that relationship, they call you first. And that saves you so much face value on bad media in having to react rather than be able to be proactive and engage in that community in making sure that they are seeing that their public servants are working for them. I've said in many seminars that if you have an administrator, a leader, no matter what their rank is, that inhibits you from having community access or community engagement, that person should be removed from that position. And I say that very effectively, and I'm not wavering on my words, because without that ability for a public servant to on their own engage with a member of the community, you're only hurting the entire organization. And by hurting the organization, it goes back twofold to the community, and that could potentially lead to property damage or death.
This next excerpt is from Episode 7, with Julie Parker from Julie Parker Communications. In this excerpt, Julie talks about the sense of urgency, specifically in the area of social media and addressing a potential crisis as quickly as you can via social media.
Well, we could talk about any number of things when it comes to urgency. I think that it might be safe to say that my background as a reporter helped me with having that sense of urgency. I tend to operate like we are always up against the clock because, as you well know, with the advent of social media about a decade or so ago, that was a game changer. And because social media exists, there has got to be a sense of urgency on the part of whomever's reputation has just taken that hit. There is no, if it happens on a Friday evening, let's wait through the weekend. Can we deal with this on Monday? And I am still shocked how often that kind of mentality takes place. And I'm not just talking small town USA. I'm talking in some cases, large PDs that have that sense of we've got time. And there is no time when a true crisis occurs. There's no time to wait. You've got to start moving immediately.
In episode 8, we talked to Chief of Police Christopher Menino. He recently retired and now he's working with Julie Parker Communications. Chris talks about community engagement and why agencies don't think that they need to do it.
Well, I think I'd start with the reverse and ask, why don't so many agencies focus on community engagement? And I think the answer is because we don't have competition. No matter how poorly we do, people don't have another law enforcement agency to turn to. If you live in Chicago, it's Chicago PD. If you live in LA, it's LAPD. And both great agencies, by the way. I'm just picking two cities. But the point is that if you have a bad police department, the people don't really have a lot of choice to go to another source for law enforcement. Where in the private sector, everyone's fighting for mind share. Everyone's fighting for to be the person or the entity that the consumer is going after, right? And so we don't have that competition. So I think a lot of agencies put it on the back burner. But the reality is we can't be effective in law enforcement if we're not working in partnership with the community. And that's not just a catchphrase. It's not just trying to be up with the times. That has literal meaning. We cannot effectively police if we're not policing in partnership with the community. And how do you do that if you're not communicating with them? How do you do that if you're not being transparent, if they don't have the information they need to assist you? It goes back to Sir Robert Peel, the founding of law enforcement. I mean, one of the basic principles is that the police are the public. The only difference being the police are the ones who are paid full-time to provide protection. And so many times along history, we've gotten away from that basic concept. But communication brings us back to that point. It brings us back to the position of we're working in concert with the community to provide safety. Otherwise, we're an occupying army. Otherwise, we just come in, we police, we enforce, and we leave. That's not a recipe for success. We have to have a long-term relationship.
We jump all the way to episode 12 with Yal Bar-Tur. She was former social media specialist that created all of NYPD's social media accounts. And we talked to Yal about the George Floyd homicide and why it had such an impact.
I think the murder of George Floyd, from a PIO perspective, we don't get many incidents, at least not, and you've been doing this longer than I have, but I can't think of any, or I don't think of any other public incident that happened that it was so clear cut that you see that, and every cop I know, even the most like aggressive cop, looks and says like, what was that guy thinking? So it is even a little, it's there's no gray area. So you can come out and say, that you condemn that and your, officers shouldn't behave that way. I think the harder thing is, what do you do when, there's something like Michael Brown in Ferguson? where, we all know what the agency there did. They didn't really do anything. They didn't message anything, and they let the narrative kind of come out without any input from the agency itself. So I think those are the tough cases. And I know this sounds a bit like a cliche, but it's true that honesty and authenticity are always should be your guiding lights. So if your agency did something wrong, you can come out and say we did something wrong. If your agency didn't do something wrong, you have to kind of gently and empathetically explain and say why your officers behaved the way they behaved. And if you don't know the details yet, which we all know happens a lot when, we're dealing with use of force investigations, you come out and say, we don't know the details yet, and we're committed to keeping you posted and letting you know throughout this process.
This next excerpt is from episode 15 with Megan Terlecki. She's the PIO of the Mesa County Sheriff's Office, and she talks about making that transition from talking to the media to talking directly to your community.
Oh man, it's I think my job has evolved over I've been here. Before it was very reactive, waiting for media to come ask me questions. And now I actually spend most of my time not talking with media, but instead talking directly to community members, whether it's writing stories or producing videos to tell our agency's story, or putting together some community events or community outreach, thinking bigger and broader on how do I reach those people who need to hear this message. It's easy to put out a social media post about, hey, there's a scam that's going around. But truly, typically the people who are affected the most by scams aren't on social media. So instead, we're creating posters and we're putting them up at the point of sale of gift cards, because that's really popular with sales. We're putting them up at pharmacies, at doctors' offices. We're trying to think a little bit more outside the box to say, okay, I can communicate a little, what's happening, what's going on with the agency, but what can I do to maybe help with the preventative side of things? Fooling on developing marketing campaigns around crime prevention, to see if there's some things that I can do to help move the needle in terms of some of the crimes that we're seeing in our community.
In episode 17, we talked to Associate Professor Amanda Hughes, who is from Brigham Young University. And Amanda talks about crisis communications via social media and being able to communicate with people over social media in a crisis.
Yeah, totally. So I actually first noticed this phenomena in Hurricane Sandy, which was like 2012. And there was a flooded community, and they weren't able to get through to 911 because everything was just overloaded, because it was in the New York area, a very heavily populated area. And so they started sending out messages for calls for help, saying that, I have a grandmother and she's stuck in the second floor of her house, or things like that. And they were posting it on social media. And at first everyone was like, don't post this on social media. We can't handle this on social media. But they said, but we have nowhere else to post it because we can't get through to 911. And so they kind of, one of the dispatchers at their, I don't remember exactly where, but started recognizing that this was a need, that they couldn't just ignore this. They had to figure out, okay, well, if there are people sending messages over social media, we need to figure out how we can find them and do something with them. So they were kind of passing them on through their, to dispatch, kind of behind the scenes, some of these requests for help through social media. And then we saw it's happened many times since in different communities. And so the paper that you were talking about specifically was about, it was Hurricane Harvey, and how the same thing happened. The system was just overloaded. They couldn't get through calls to the typical 911 dispatchers. And so people were sending out messages for help on social media. But most emergency management organizations are not equipped to know how to get that information, to extract it, especially when a big event happens and you're busy and you're doing other things. And just, depending on the area, if you may be getting like millions of messages over social media and having to sort through those to find the ones that have people actually asking for help is a really difficult task.
In episode 20, we talked to Mickey Troost. She is the Strategic Communications Director for the Colorado Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And of course, what would Mickey talk about? Wildfires.
The number one challenge is just knowing exactly what's happening in the local jurisdiction. So having that timely information and those updates. And the way that we stay in contact with the local jurisdiction is to be part of their PIO teams or their JICs. And so in Colorado, I do that with several of our counties through mobile apps like WhatsApp or GroupMe or Microsoft Teams. So I'm part of that team when they stand up. And then the other side of that is that the state of Colorado has what we call field managers who go out to the local emergency operations center. And our field manager gives me real-time updates as well. And he lets me know what kind of PIO support the county or the local jurisdiction needs.
In episode 24, we talked to Lisa Drews from Strategia Communications, and she talks about knowing your strengths and knowing when to say things.
They have to understand what their strengths and weaknesses are. Their strengths are likely that they have ties to the community. They have good communication skills with residents, constituents, third-party groups, clergy, Boy Scouts, and the media. Even though social media, it pains me to say this as a 21-year journalist, social media is more important than traditional media, but the media still plays a key role, especially in smaller communities. They have to recognize their strengths and weaknesses, and the strengths are the connectivities they have. The weaknesses are they are usually not trained for crisis response. And crisis response is the number one thing is you have to acknowledge something has happened. You don't need to give huge details on what happened, but you need to acknowledge that something has happened. You are looking into it and you're going to get back to them with more information as soon as you can. Absolutely. I mean, just acknowledge that something has happened and they'll get back to them. Robert, I got to tell you, about 15 years ago, I was on a really long bike ride because I was doing crazy things called century rides on a road bike. And all of a sudden my phone started blowing up with our friend, John Nebel and Tom Kasha, who is a former SAC of the Secret Service in Chicago. Everyone was texting me, oh my God, there's a shooting in River Forest where I lived at the time. Are you okay? Do you know anything about it? I'm like, what are you talking about? What are you talking? This is like 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. River Forest is like Mayberry for those of your listeners who remember, Gomer Pyle but I was like, what are you guys talking about? So I started looking on social media, listening to the radio. Do you know it was hang on a second. It was 4 or 5 hours. Okay. It was 4 or 5 hours after the shooting happened that the River Forest Police Department acknowledged that there was a shooting in the community. By that time, and River Forest is outside of Chicago by 9 miles. By that time, CBS Radio in Chicago had every hour on the half hour talked about this shooting in River Forest. And the line was, there's been no comment from River Forest Police Department. And when you hear no comment, that is essentially an admission of guilt. Like you're hiding something or you did something wrong. 4.5 hours, they did not even acknowledge that there was a shooting in River Forest. And it ended up being a really sad domestic shooting, but it's a town that nothing happens, yet the police department wouldn't even acknowledge that there even was a shooting and they were looking into it. They could have quashed the fears of residents. They're on top of it, they're investigating, they know about it, but they didn't even do that. And it was, I never worked with the village, and I use this as an example. I love the village and they have a fantastic police chief now who was not the chief at the time. But the point of the matter is just acknowledge something's happened so that you appear knowledgeable and you appear like you're working on it.
So there's a lot of worry about TikTok and the information that it may be sharing with China. But let me go back to episode 25 with the public information officer, Melinda Gutierrez from Dallas PD. Dallas does an exceptional job with their TikTok account. It's basically a recruiting account for the police department. But let me tell you, Melinda's the one that got it there. So if you haven't listened to episode 25, go back and listen to it, and then just listen to this short excerpt of where she got the idea and why.
So TikTok, being new, I knew it was coming around. So I created my own TikTok account and kind of was learning the functions. But there was an officer who's in our mounted unit. She's, brand new in the mounted unit, great officer. She was on TikTok as well. So I was following her. She was also recognized by some of our command staff that saw her as well. And they brought her in. We had a meeting. It was mostly with personnel. So if you've noticed, we're using it more as a recruiting tool. Younger generation, they're on TikTok.
I think it's a great way of doing it.
We're using it as a recruiting tool. That's the main function of TikTok. So she was brought in to help. She's helped with a couple of videos. I've actually featured in one video, which I wasn't trying to be. I was just trying to show our officers how to kind of dance. It was at the state fair. And she recorded. She's like, I'm putting you in there. I'm like, great. I wasn't trying to be in it. I was just trying to be on the sidelines. But she has helped tremendously. She's great with the app. When I need her help, I call upon her. One of them, which was, that I did myself, which was, I was like, oh my gosh, this actually went somewhere, was our You Want to Bomb. I don't know if you saw that one. So those are our two police officers in our unit. And we hadn't created a TikTok in a while. And I'm like, I need to get one out because we want to be consistent with, getting some content out there. So I showed them the dance the night before. I posted them both the link. They practiced it. It was so funny because the sergeant who was over recruiting, he was like, Melinda, I love you, but I hate you at the same time. We have so many people that are from South Africa because it's a popular song over there. Okay. They're calling and they want to come be DPD. I said, well, I'm doing what it's supposed to do. I'm getting people to email and call. And so it's just been a great tool. We have the younger generation who's following us now. Our numbers have the best video was our the challenge, the push-up challenge one.
Oh, yeah.
That was when her name is Ana Vasquez. Senior Corporal Vasquez was the one who she did that one on her own. And before we knew it, we were at 2 million followers. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like she really knocked it over the top. And now it's just keeping the content fresh, keeping the content within trending, and not overdoing it.
In episode 26, we talked to Captain Sheila Kelleher. She is the first female PIO for the LA County Fire Department. And Sheila has a lot of history. So if you want to go back and listen to episode 26, I encourage you to. But Sheila has some thoughts about the cutting edge of technology and public information officers' jobs. So give it a listen.
Yeah. I think we have to just stay right on that edge of what the latest and greatest platform is out there to get information disseminated as fast as possible. There's so many great apps out there now with Pulse Point, Citizen, Twitter, Insta, all those things. But there are some that are geared specifically for safety. So I think there's some cool opportunities we may have coming forward. I can't say much about now, but that we could get involved with them. And really just know there's a bunch of different ways to communicate now. And the days of sending emails to everybody is long gone. It's like it's instantaneous. And we have to make sure we keep our technology up for that. Everybody wants to see video and pictures as quick as possible. So we become cameramen in the field, reporters in the field. And it's just making sure we've got what we need to get out. Because what happens is if we don't have the quick technology, they're going to make it up in a bad way, but they're going to fill in the gaps the way they want to. It's like they're going to just create the story they want to create. It's like, well, we haven't heard yet from what's happening. And it's literally 3 minutes into the incident. And it's just all of a sudden speculation starts coming, not on our part, but that's where it's just like, hey, boom, 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 where your network's connected and we get that story out as fast as possible.
In this next excerpt, we go to episode 32 with Deputy Chief Chris Covelli, who is from the Lake County Sheriff's Office and also the Public Information Officer for the Major Crimes Task Force. That is a regional task force that handles homicides and major incidents for the entire county of Lake County, Illinois. Chris is the person that shined in front of the camera and managed the press conference for the July 4th Highland Park shooting. So sit back, relax, and listen to how he came into the original press conference.
Actually, I had gotten there just prior to. Basically, I'll give you a rundown of how I got involved. My wife is a police commander in Lincolnshire, and I took my 3 kids out to the Lincolnshire parade. She was working that day, and so we were going to watch the parade and then visit with her for a little bit before coming back home. So she called me and she said, "Did you hear what's going on in Highland Park?" I said, "No, what's going on?" And she said, she told me, she said, "There's somebody shooting people on the parade route, active shooters still shooting." Her and her colleagues were headed to assist. She told me the Lincolnshire parade was going to be canceled. So I called into my dispatch to find out what was going on and just see how we were responding as an agency. And they told me, yeah, active shooter. We've got a couple dozen deputies that are en route to assist Highland Park. So I scooped my kids, loaded them out, flew back home to my house, which is in McHenry County. So it's a little bit of a hike from Lincolnshire, but dropped the kids off and flew into work. I contacted the deputy chief of Highland Park on my way. At this point, I knew there had been at least one death with multiple injured, potentially multiple casualties. So I knew it was going to be a major crime case as it was in Lake County, and Highland Park is a member of the Major Crime Task Force. So I also am the public information officer for that entity. So I let the Highland Park chief know, deputy chief know that I was on my way out there, happy to assist in whatever capacity they needed. And I got there, I would say probably about 11:30 or so. And I walked into the command post. I went directly there, which was at a fire station about 3/4 of a mile away from the scene. And walking in there, to an untrained eye, it looked like just chaos with probably 120, 130 people inside. But I'll tell you, every single person that was in there had a job. They were doing that job. They had a role to contribute to, whether it be working on logistics out at the scene, working on determining who the offender was, working on potential apprehension efforts once the offender was identified. I mean, it truly a lot of people, a lot going on, but it was very, very well run. And I'll tell you, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but that really was a key to being able to gather critical information quickly from the stakeholders and collaborate with Chief Jogman from Highland Park and the other administrators that the decision makers on deciding what we were going to release. That it was like a well-oiled machine, and it was really something. So when I walked in, they directed me right away to Chief Jogman. Chief Jogman and I have known each other as acquaintances, never really worked together prior to this. And I'll tell you, I'm amazed at his leadership, terrific leadership, and he did an amazing job running this chaos, he and his command staff and his department. So he directed me to the city manager, and I had never met the city manager before, but introduced myself, told her, here's what I'm here to help with. I suggested that we get out in front of the camera right now and hold a press conference. As you know, and other law enforcement and fire department public information officers know, getting the information out fast in a critical incident is critical. It's key. They were all on the same page. The collaboration was phenomenal. So we crafted a message, and talking with Chief Jogman and the city manager, we decided it would be best if I went out. So I was actually at the first press conference. However, I felt it was best that Commander Chris O'Neill, who ran the incident at the scene, speak about the actual incident. He had all those intricate facts. He knew what happened because he was there and he was running it, and people needed to know at that point what happened. And then we went into some detail about the fact we have not yet identified who this shooter was. We were working to determine, is this shooter operating by themselves, or did they have a second person? They're considered armed and dangerous. We had a very, very vague description at that point. However, and normally if this weren't a critical incident, it's probably something we would not have put out to the public just because it was so very vague. But with the gravity and the magnitude of the situation, we put out what we had. Every time we had information, we were pushing it out because we wanted to be 100% transparent. So getting back to your question, just walking in there, yeah, it certainly would have looked chaotic to somebody that probably is not in the profession, but I've never seen a command post. It's such a high gravity situation run as efficiently as this. And one of the greatest things was, in every profession, you have people that there's some egos involved. There were no egos. Everybody was there trying to contribute. No muscle flexing. Everyone was just getting along between the federal partners, the state partners, the local partners. It was really, really good. And that, in my opinion, there's no doubt that helped lead to concluding this within about 12 hours.
In this next excerpt from episode 33, we talked to Melissa Agnes from the Crisis Ready Institute on how to overcome emotion with emotional intelligence.
Oh man. Okay, so the crisis ready rule is you cannot beat emotion with logic. And that's a mistake that leaders constantly try to make because we try to rationalize, and human beings are wired for emotion. We are emotional beings, whether we want to admit it or not. And so why it's important is because we're emotional beings. Emotion, most people, and there's research and studies that show this, most people can identify 3 emotions within themselves: happiness, sadness, anger. And meanwhile, there's a spectrum of emotion. And so if we can't even articulate the emotions that we're feeling, that means that those emotions more often than not are driving. And what happens with emotion is that it clouds judgment. I see it as like something happens and emotion is your heart. It triggers your heart, whether it's anger or sadness or fear or whatever it is. Your heart kicks into gear with that emotion and it comes up and it blocks the logical side of your brain. And that's the way that we're wired. So, if your heart is blocking your brain, so the emotion is blocking the logic, and you try to come with your crisis communication and only speak logic, that's completely blocked by the heart. So the only way, and this is where EQ comes in, emotional intelligence, is the only way to get through and lead to that logic, because you do need to lead with logic, right? But the only way to get through that clouded judgment is through the heart. So you need to resonate on an emotional level. You need to validate emotions so that people feel heard and understood. Whether you agree with them or not is not the question, is that they feel heard and understood. Then they need to feel as though you actually relate to the thing that matters to them. So now you're speaking to their heart, you're reassuring their heart, and then they'll go, okay, that's why I should hear you out. That's why I should listen to you. That's why you're worth following. Now bring me the logic.
For this final excerpt, we go to episode 36 with Lori Ellen Smith from Cat 5 Communications. And she talks about, as a PIO, when you're in the room with all the other leaders, that you need to speak up when you're trying to address a point that is going to impact the agency.
You may, and conversely, as a trusted advisor, you've got to speak that truth to power. And it's tough to be in a room of very important people. And I'll give you a great example. It was following one of the hurricanes, and forgive me, I have to look at a list because we had so many hurricanes and close calls in Florida. But one of the things that most impressed me, and I will say this, they do emergency management brilliantly. They do it very well here in Mississippi too. I'm very fortunate to be affiliated in both places. But I saw the most amazing thing. So we had evacuated the beaches for a hurricane, and Governor at the time, Rick Scott, had a superpower. He would call these mayors, and he was working the phones constantly. What do you need? What do you need? How can I help? And it's what a good leader does, right? Ask the people what they can do to help. And you're in a room with very powerful, important people, and you're asked a question. And at the time, the question was, what do we need to do? And I made the comment to my commander, we evacuate them when we absolutely know we have to, but we've got to get them back just as quickly as we can, or they won't trust us the next time and leave. And it's one of the things in emergency management you're always mindful of. And you just have to have the compunction. You just have to have the will to say that in a room. When you're a PIO and you're sitting at the, at that command table, you have to be, you have to always be ready to speak the truth to power. And even if it's, hey, I don't think this is a good time for this, and here's why, or even if it's an offline conversation and you leave the room, if you make sure somebody in an authority position knows your most qualified, knowledgeable opinion on that subject.
What an amazing year 2022 was. This podcast has grown so rapidly this year. We had 36 guests this year. We recorded 1,063 minutes and 32 seconds of audio. You guys downloaded the podcast 8,459 times. That's double what we did last year. 73% of you are listening to the podcast on Apple, either Apple Podcasts or on iTunes. 6% of you are listening to it on Stitcher, 4% on the web, and 4% on iHeartradio. For those of you that really want to know, 78% of you are listening on some kind of Apple product, whether it is an iPhone, an iPad, or an Apple computer. 8% are on Androids, and the last are on Windows-based computers. I will continue to grow this podcast into 2023. I've already interviewed and recorded some amazing guests for future episodes in 2023. I will be looking to schedule other guests in the coming weeks, and I will continue to grow the podcast. From the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you for sharing the podcast with your colleagues and friends. And I wish you all a safe and happy holiday and a happy new year. And we will see you back here in mid-January for season 3 of the PIO podcast. Thank you and good night.